As we know that we are in the season of Vijayadashmi, and in this context, Telangana region is categorically known for celebrating Bathukamma. And in this context, we will have to understand that Bathukamma as a regional festival has a certain anthropological perspective. In fact, when we observe the kind of the field work that was done with respect to Bathukamma, we see a number of individuals had done field work on Bathukamma. One is the Thirumalai or the G.N. Rao's understanding of Bathukamma. And when we observe these dimensions of Bathukamma, there were three methods which were seen in the analysis. One was with respect to the participant observation, which was followed as a field methodology. The second one that was followed was the content analysis. As we know that there are multiple folk songs which are released during the season of Bathukamma, venerating the culture of Telangana. And in that context, after the content analysis of the songs, and apart from that, we also see there were necessary survey methods which were utilized, and in that context, we get to understand the anthropological perspective of Bathukamma as a festival. And in that context, when you look at the anthropological perspective, one dimension that we need to understand is Bathukamma is that festival which is celebrated for 9 long days. And in fact, it fundamentally symbolizes the feminine character as well as the dimensions of fertility. And apart from that, when we look at certain perspectives, one major perspective which Bathukamma speaks about is the gender roles. In fact, we observe that it emphasizes on the domestic responsibilities as well as the reproductive responsibilities of women. And not only the gender role, it fundamentally also challenges the gender status. That means we see an element of challenge that is being created to a perspective of social stratification, or where gender becomes a basis for social stratification. And commemorating and celebrating the festivity, understanding the dimensions of feminine character and the fertility, we see it is challenging the social stratification which is based on gender. The third perspective that we see is from the dimensions of rituals and performance. And when we observe from the dimensions of rituals and performance, we see that it fundamentally shows the women agency. It fundamentally shows the women agency. It not only shows the women agency, but it also shows the element of creativity that is seen to be integrated into the culture. The dimension is again seen. As we observe in anthropology, we see culture is a mental construct which is seen in the context of the cognitive approach of the anthropology. And we will be able to understand that dimension. And apart from that, we also see there is an aspect of symbolism which is important to be understood in this festival. And when we understand the symbolic perspective of Bathukamma as such, we see it symbolizes fertility, it symbolizes purity, and apart from that, it also symbolizes the feminine power. Because Bathukamma as a festival is fundamentally known for flowers, colors, water, and in that context we see that there is a symbolic perspective which is existing with respect to Bathukamma as a festival. And apart from that perspective, we also see one very, very important dimension which has to be understood. If you look at various theories which talk about Bathukamma or which justify the dimensions of Bathukamma, one fundamental theory which looks into the justification of Bathukamma is one we see there is a structural functionalist perspective of Bathukamma. And when we look at the structural functionalist perspective, because in 6th chapter of anthropology we see that Radcliffe Brown happens to be one of the structural functionalists who talks about the structural functionalism. And apart from that, we have many such Indian anthropologists who were understanding the structural functionalism, that is from the side of M.N. Srinivas to a larger extent. And when we observe this, the structural functional perspective, it maintains a social order. It maintains a social order. It not only maintains the social order, it reinforces the cultural norms. It reinforces the cultural norms which is seen to be existing. Then apart from that, it also has an element of the cultural exchanges which are seen. The second perspective that we see from the side of anthropology is, we can talk about the symbolic anthropology we just discussed, or the symbolic perspective, where it symbolizes feminine character, it symbolizes fertility, and also it symbolizes an element of purity which is seen to be existing. The third perspective that we see is the feminist perspective. Now when we look at the feminist perspective in the context of anthropology, in the context of Bathukamma as such, it challenges the patriarchal mindsets of the society. It challenges the patriarchal mindsets of the society. It fundamentally celebrates the feminine power of the society. And we see that patriarchy, one side, was intertwined with certain cultural elements. But we see Bathukamma as a cultural entity challenging these patriarchal mindsets which are seen to be existing. So when we observe this, not only that, we also see there is one very, very important dimension which has to be remembered here. From the dimensions of paper 2, if you consider, we see that it is a testimonial for a folk-urban continuum. Because we see that certain elements of folk culture, certain elements of folk tradition, certain elements of folk celebrations are observed in Bathukamma as a festival. And we also see in the recent times what has been happening. The urban elements are seen to be added to this dimension. And because of which we see that there is an element of cultural diversity which is observed in Bathukamma as a festival. The second aspect that we see, that we always see a clear interaction of the little tradition and the great tradition. We see an interaction of the little tradition and the great tradition, where we observe Yogendra Singh categorically says that the traditional dimension and the modernization dimension can never be a discrete identities. And it is always assumed to be a continuum observing the microscopic as well as the macroscopic perspectives of the culture, of the tradition as well. So in that context, we talk about the little tradition and the great tradition perspectives. And in general, when we observe Bathukamma as a festival, it was more of a little tradition. It was more of a little tradition. It was more of a tradition which was seen in the folk cultures. It was more of a tradition which was followed in the rural areas. It was more of a tradition which was observed with certain elements which were intertwined with ecology and environment. And in fact, if I have to add, we can also look at the cultural ecology perspective which was given by Julian H. Stewart in this context. We also have the culture ecology perspective which is present with respect to Bathukamma as a festival. We see that the flowers, the water, and all of those dimensions, the diversity, the variety that is observed here, how closely is the culture, how closely is the ecology, how closely is the environment intertwined. And Bathukamma is an agglomeration of all of these dimensions which are supposed to be seen. And in that context, when we see Bathukamma was more of a little tradition. But these days what is seen to be happening, we see that the Bathukamma has been celebrated in the urban centers. It has been having certain hybridization phenomena. We see the online publications of Bathukamma. We see certain digital forms of Bathukamma being celebrated. We see various cultures being present. We see various dimensions of projections. For example, if I have to tell you simply, DJs in Bathukamma is more of an hybridized version that is generally observed. And this process is what is considered to be the dimension of universalization of culture. We know that whenever there is an interaction between great tradition and little tradition, we see the universalization of culture, and we also see an element of parochialization of culture. That means when the little tradition is seen to be perceived as the great tradition, we call it as universalization. And when the vice versa condition is seen to be observed, we call it as parochialization dimension. So to summarize, we see Bathukamma as a festival which is seen to be having a feminist perspective, which is seen to be having a culture ecology perspective, which is seen to be having a symbolic perspective, which is seen to be having a structural functionalist perspective. And we see that everybody celebrating, and in that context there is a greater dimension of cultural revivalism which is observed from the societies of Telangana, which is observed from the cultures of Telangana, the cultural revivalist movements which are seen to be present. we see that it breaks certain ethnic boundaries which are fundamentally observed. An element of ethnicity is broken down in the festival of Bathukamma as such. So this is what is a brief understanding of anthropological exploration of Bathukamma. That means we are able to link the concepts of anthropology to one of the most famous festivals of this country and one of the most regionally celebrated festival to a larger extent, that is Bathukamma.